I graduated from Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia in 1971. And although I have many, many wonderful memories of Spelman, the one that stands out in my mind is the moment when I knew I was a writer. That's where it happened. Dr. Gales, an author, a poet, at the time was just out of graduate school teaching her first college courses. And she taught me African American literature. I did a paper on Zora Neale Hurston, who had just been rediscovered at the time. This was in the late 60s, early 70s. And I got an A on the paper. And when I went to Dr. Gales to tell her how excited I was about the paper, she said the most important words that have ever been spoken to me. She said, "You're a writer, don't you know that?" And although I had always known I was a writer, although growing up in Macon, Georgia, I was always told I was going to be a writer, my family always said, you know, Tina's going to be a writer. Anytime they caught me reading a book, anytime John Oliver Killings, who grew up in Macon, Georgia, was mentioned, went to school with my father, anytime he was mentioned, someone would say, well, you know, Tina's going to be a writer. I'd heard it my whole life, but I'd never heard it from a professor. I'd never heard it from a writer. And she said it so matter-of-factly, you know, don't you know you're a writer? I used to see at my father's juke joint, men and women who were trying to, you know, hustle a little drink or a beer or something would sit down and kind of tell a story. And the people at the table who were buying would sort of, you know, pass them a glass and pour them a little gin or, you know, pour them a beer from the big quart bottle because they were telling stories. When I was growing up, sitting at the dinner table, whether it was for breakfast or for dinner, in my household was a big deal. I'm the youngest of 5 children. My mother and father were there. Sometimes my grandfather was there. Sometimes my great aunt. But there were stories that were told around the dinner table, around food. And my father would always start the conversation at the dinner table the same way. And he would look around the table and say, well, and what did you do today? And so we knew this was coming. So all day long, all the children, and maybe my mama too, was thinking about things she was going to say at the dinner table. If you see something interesting, my father was a big train buff. His father, my grandfather, worked on the railroad, the MDS, the Macon, Dublin, Savannah line. And so he was always fascinated with trains. So you knew if you saw a train that day on the way to school, oh, you got you a story. And what fascinated me as the baby of the family, I'm the youngest of 5 children, was that no matter how old you were, how young you were, how inconsequential you were in the world, or even in your family feeling that way sometimes as the baby, you could hold forth at the dinner table. If you had an interesting story, everybody stopped eating and listened to your story. And so we were always looking for stories to tell. You know, my father was always looking for experiences. You know, he used to tell us all the time, you know, you got to be able to make conversation in this world. You know, for him, that was a commodity that you could trade with. You know how to be able to go in and go to a bank and ask for a loan. You got to know how to make conversation. You know, if you're going to take care of an older relative, you know, you got to sit around and listen and make conversation. I mean, making conversation was a huge part of it. And now that I think about it, it was about words, and it was about stories, and it was about ideas. And in our house, reading was valued too. Again, you know, I think everything makes you who you are. When I hear mothers and fathers, you know, talk so disparagingly to their children, you know, come on, you're so slow, you know, you're not ever going to be anywhere on time. I think, oh God, don't tell them that. You're telling them what they're going to be. This child is going to be slow and late the rest of his or her life, because we are what our people tell us that we are. And so my family told me that I was going to be a writer. You know, they made sure that there were books in the house. You know, anytime there was a question anywhere around the dinner table in my house, my father would say the same thing. Before it was out of your mouth, go look it up. You know, and after a while, my older siblings would kind of got on to it, so they stopped asking questions because we got tired of, you know, doing a project every day, going to look it up. Actually, what my father used to say, you got those damn expensive encyclopedias I paid for in there, go look it up. And of course, the baby of the family, I don't care. Give me attention. I don't care what you're doing. Whether you're whipping me, whether you're kissing me, just, let me the center of attention. And I continued to ask stories. So, ask questions. So I still had to, go look it up. And so we would look things up. So there were books in the house. And my father read, everybody in my family were voracious readers. The children were big readers because our parents were big readers. I tell parents now, they say, I can't get my children to read. You don't have to make them read. Get them a library card and let them see you reading. Don't let them interrupt you when you're reading. Tell them, no, not right now. Like my mother used to tell me, not now, baby, mama's reading. The most important thing she ever said to me. So books and ideas and words were important in my house. And my parents were not educators, neither one of them went to college until my mother went back to school after we all went to college. But, they were, middle class folks who ran businesses, juke joints and liquor stores. And, my mother volunteered at the PTA and did things at the school. Just a regular family. But they read all the time. And they encouraged us to read. And there were books around. And we had to go look up in those expensive damn encyclopedias when we had a question. And in the bathroom, there were books. And by my mother's bedside table, there were books. And she had a reading chair, a big pink sitting chair in the living room. And that was her reading chair. And we couldn't interrupt her when she was sitting there reading a hardback book. She was an only child. And she had 5 children. She said she had babies, so she couldn't have babies anymore. She always wanted brothers and sisters. And so she loved being a mother. She was a very accessible mother, but not when she was reading. And that made a big impression on us. So I'm a writer for all those reasons, because I think I was given a gift of the talent to be able to write. But the biggest gift I was given was to know how important words are and how important stories are. Like many black kids of the era when I came up in the middle of the last century, is I wanted to read books that I couldn't find. Young people now don't realize how extraordinary it is, the number of books that are being being written by black people. At one time, you could read 20 years ago, you could read every novel that black people wrote. They came out just that seldom, And now you go in the bookstore, you don't even recognize people's names. They're working on their 3rd and 4th novel. You want to know, who are these people? I haven't even heard of them. They're children's books and westerns and mysteries and romances and, high literature, like, Toni Morris, and then low literature and contemporary. There are all kinds of books and reading material now. And I think that when I was coming up, I always wanted to read about little girls and boys like myself when I read children's books, and I didn't see it before. So that's another reason I think I'm a writer, is I wanted to write, like many writers, I wanted to write what I want to read. And that's what I create. Mm-hmm. Zora Neale Hurston, the wonderful anthropologist and writer of essays, writer of novels, writer of plays, Southern woman from Florida, from all black town, black woman who invented herself over and over again, who respected the word, but not only respected the word, respected black folks and black folk stories and their folklore and their legends and their lies, and their telling stories on the porch, all of that, their lives. She absolutely inspired me. I discovered her, as many writers did, in the late 60s, early 70s, when her work was reissued. For a number of years, Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is Zora Neale Hurston's, I guess, masterpiece. Most people would think it's her masterpiece. I do too. Wonderful novel. Love story about finding yourself, coming of age story of history and culture. Was reissued in that time, I think the late 60s. And so you couldn't get it before, you couldn't buy it before this, and it was reissued and republished. And it changed my life, like it changed many others' lives. I was very blessed to meet a number of writers who were very helpful to me, who gave me an entree into publishing. And Bill Dill, who wrote Sharky's Machine and Seven and Primal Fear, lived on the same island that I did, St. Simon's Island, where I live now. And he and my husband were friends, and then we became friends with him and his wife. And he was a best-selling author when I met him, and I hadn't published anything. And he's the one who said, will you write a book, Tina? And I go, oh, yeah, like everybody, oh, yeah, I'm writing a book. He said, well, let me see it. And I said, oh, yeah, I'll let you see. He says, no, get in the car now. We were at his house. Go home and get this. So I had to go home. And luckily, I had some pages. And he read them and said, this is wonderful. He says, if you get 100, 150 pages, I'll show it to my agent. Well, his agent at the time, it's my agent now, but at the time was Owen Laster, who's the head of William Morris literary division. And so I knew a deal when I heard one. So I got to work and started right away working on this novel that had been a short story about a little girl in the South who goes up the street to get her hair done and meets this wonderful, beautiful black woman who's from the who's from the Sea Islands, and she speaks, with a Gullah accent, and she teaches her how to be nosy. And it started out as a short story, and I would send it off and get rejection slips, and it would grow, and then it would grow. Well, who is this child, and what are her parents like, and why is she special? So it just grew into the novel, A Baby of the Family. So I did indeed get 150 pages together, and Bill sent it off to his agent, and Owen, gave it to an agent there at William Morris, and so I got a publisher. I mean, it's just sort of unheard of for it to be that easy. And this was in 1986, so this was a different time. And the first people who read it, I think, was my Simon and Schuster turned it down, and then somebody else turned it down, and the third publisher to read it was Harcourt Brace. At the time, they were Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, very literary publisher. And I was just thrilled, and they bought it for a very small amount of money, but I was so thrilled. I was no problem. I was happy to be published, happy that they thought it was worthwhile. And so I did 2 books with Harcourt, and I did 1 book with Doubleday, and which is my third. I did Baby of the Family and Ugly Ways with Harcourt. I did The Hand I Fan With, my 3rd novel, with Doubleday, and my 4th book, You Know Better, novel with William Morrow, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. And so I had that wonderful entree, which was a wonderful experience getting in. Now, the balance of that is that publishing, can really be hell. It really can, even after getting a contract, because, especially I think for African-American people, for women, for gay people, anybody who's, not sort of mainstream, because many times they don't know you. They don't know, your culture. They don't publish you. They publish you, but don't promote you in the best possible way, because the people in the publicity department don't always know the importance of book clubs and sororities and black colleges and churches and all the things that that are really important to African American writers. And there's a balance. Sometimes they want you to be a crossover. They're interested in you being a crossover writer, which means you aren't just read by one sector. You're read by white people and black people and old people and young people and gay people and straight people. And of course, every writer wants that also. So there are lots of things going on. I mean, just what the cover of the book is going to look like. When you're in publishing, you're in business. And so, when you're writing from your soul. You're sitting down, as some author said, and opening up a vein and, letting it drip on the computer, the typewriter. But when you're publishing, you're trying to sell your stuff. That's a business, as they say. And so there is that clash, I think, of that. The other thing is my biggest complaint, I guess, or my biggest challenge is what every African-American author has a big challenge of, and that is of not being a trend. I mean, if you write contemporary fiction, literary fiction, which is what I write, I want to write that forever. I don't want to come in and out of style. I don't want, thug fiction or street fiction or chick lit or any of those things to really affect that. I think there's a place for all of those genres, but I think there should also be a place for, straight ahead, wonderful writing, whether it's, literary writing or whether it's pop fiction or whether, it's mystery. So things don't go in and out. And what I find for African American people is that, at one point you're hot, the next point you're not hot. What's in right now. And I think it's sort of that one through the turnstile at a time. One through the turnstile at a time. Okay, this is the hot person this year. This is the hot person. When there should be a flood of writers coming through. It shouldn't have to be either me or you. It should be all of us. I am a writer because I can't be anything else. And I think that's true of many writers. When people call it a calling, or refer to it as a calling, it really is a calling. In the true sense of the word, that the words call you, stories call you. I grew up in Macon, Georgia in the 50s and 60s, at the time when African American people told stories all the time, sitting on the porch, at funerals, at weddings, after church on Sunday, they told stories to calm children down to go to sleep. I mean, stories were all around. I remember just feeling like I was living in a world made up of stories. I would listen to my mother gossip on the phone when I was at home, when I was a child, and I would think, oh, Mama's such a good storyteller, because she'd be talking about people who I didn't know by their first names. And I remember thinking, you know, just how fascinating it is. I grew up, I think also, you know, besides the calling, that your life kind of makes you who you are. And my life made me a writer. The fact that I was born African American, the fact that I was born in the South, the fact that I was born in the late 40s, at a time when television was just coming into being, where people, you know, cut off the TV and the radio when people told stories. All these things sort of made me a writer. I loved to read, and stories sort of drew me. My father owned juke joints and liquor stores, and I used to go after school. I'd go to Catholic school, and I would go down after school with my little plaid uniform on and sit at the counter next to winos and prostitutes and regular people and boosters and pickpockets and you know, the principal of the school. I mean, when I was growing up, everybody sort of went to the juke joint. It wasn't, you know, you know, a sort of underworld kind of place to be. It was a place where people just gathered. You know, women who certainly didn't drink, for instance, maybe not church women, but just good regular women, you know, downtown would, you know, would stick their heads in and get a fish sandwich without really coming in. So I had all these people around me and all these stories, and I would hear people just talking. I'm a big eavesdropper. And so I would overhear stories, and so the stories just seemed to be everywhere. The people who were denizens of the place, you know, who were there all the time, got used to me and used to tell me stories about their love life and about when they were growing up, and about needing some money, and about hard times they were having, or about a joke. I mean, my whole life seemed to be made up of stories, and I think that's what made me a writer, to see the value of stories. I mean, to be born African American in the South, it's a great gift to a storyteller, I think, to a writer. Because words are something that are very valued in our community. Stories are something that almost are a commodity.
I was actually born in Springfield, Massachusetts. My father is a minister, and he had a church in Springfield, but he was a little too radical for the church where he was, so that when I was 2 years old, they parted company, my father and the church in Springfield, and we came back to Detroit, which was my parents' hometown. So since I was 2, I really don't remember much about Massachusetts. What I remember really is Detroit, growing up in Detroit, going to school in Detroit, and it was wonderful. It was a perfect place to grow up. There was always a lot going on, a lot culturally going on. I lived on the west side of Detroit, and people from Detroit tend to break the city up into two parts. If you're from the west side, you always say, I'm from the west side, or I'm from the east side. So I was from the west side, which was where Motown was. So of course we all claimed that we knew everybody who sang for Motown. And it was funny to me because when I left Detroit and went to Howard, people would ask me, oh, you're from Detroit, this was 1966. Do you know the Temptations? You know, do you know Smokey Robinson? Because they happened to be in Detroit. And of course, I didn't know any of these guys, but it was so interesting to me that they thought that, you know, we all kind of knew each other because we happened to be in the same place. But Detroit was an interesting place to grow up. My family was very involved in the civil rights movement, very involved in voter registration, very involved in trying to get better jobs for black folks, trying to get people into management positions, so that the political life of the city was very much a part of what I was involved in growing up. My father, who was a minister of Central Congregational Church, which later became the Shrine of the Black Madonna, was always running for office. He founded a political party, the Freedom Now Party, ran for governor, ran for the school board, ran for the city council, never won any of those things, but definitely raised the bar for the campaigns, really made people talk about real issues, about really what a city should be, what a community should be. And I know that my work is very much influenced by my family's activism, by the fact that my father was a person who always used words to inspire people, to inform people, and to move them to some kind of action. And I grew up hearing that. I grew up seeing the power of words, the power of language, so that when I began to write, I was very conscious of the fact that it was not just something that I loved to do, but was also a serious responsibility, because you were, if you did it right, able to move people to do things that they never would have thought they were capable of doing. So that my family's activism, I think, really has very much influenced my idea that writing is a way to involve people in their greater lives, in the greater world, not just in their own thoughts about themselves. I have one sister, Kristen, who's 2 years older, who actually was a great influence on me because she taught me how to read and write when I was 4 years old. She was 6. And we had, we slept in little twin beds in the same room, and I assumed we were, pretty much equal. She was the older sister, but pretty much equal. Then she started school, and she came home, and I realized that she could read and write. And she was so confident about doing it, and I was just enraged because she wasn't that much older than I was, and I wanted to be able to do it. So she taught me how to read and write, and it's funny because what we did was, my mother would put us in the bed, and then we were in the front of the house, and there was a street light, and we had a little table, and we would get up and go sit at this table with a street light, and my sister would, teach me from the book that she had read in school. Now, why we thought we had to do this at night when we were supposed to be in the bed is beyond me. I still don't know. And I'm sure my mother heard us. I mean, we're 6 and 4. How quiet could we be? So I asked my sister why we had done it this way. And she thinks that the reason we did it that way is because we used to look at those things about Abe Lincoln learning how to read by the not the campfire, but the fireplace and all of that. Mm-hmm. And I think that we thought that that was part of the adventure of it, that you had to have low light and really be working hard to learn it. But she stuck with me, and she taught me how to read and write, and I started keeping little notebooks after she taught me how to do it. And I always had told stories. I had been telling her stories since I was about 2. So then when I was 4, I was able to write them down because she had given me that great gift of being literate, and that was like the first of my journals. I don't have any of those from 4 years old. I would love to know what I was writing about at 5. What was I thinking about? I always knew that I was a writer, and that sounds like mystical to say it, but I remember being 2 years old in a crib, leaning over the side of the crib, telling stories to my sister. See my sister again. And my sister would actually stop what she was doing. She was already in a twin bed because she was a little older. She was 4 by then. So she would stop what she was doing and listen to me. Now, 2 years old, what could I have been talking about, that she really felt that it was interesting enough to stop. But at that point, when I was doing it, I knew I wanted to tell stories. And then as soon as I knew there was such a thing as writing, I knew I wanted to write my stories down. So that the wonderful thing for me, which I think is a real blessing in my life, is I always knew this is what I was. So I didn't have that moment of indecision that keeps many people from claiming the fact of who they want to be, what they want to be. I never had that feeling of, can I really say I'm a writer? Because I knew that's what I was. So that I didn't have to spend years of time being insecure about it, feeling like, can I claim this, or should I make advanced preparations to be something else? I always knew I was a writer. I always told stories. I always wrote plays. I mean, I was one of those kids that on Thanksgiving, after the meal, they would go upstairs and write a little play, and I would conscript my cousins and my sister, and then we would come down and make my aunts and uncles and my parents look at these little plays that we would do about pilgrims and all of that. But it was part of what the people in my family accepted about me, because they knew that that's what I was going to do. And they always knew that I was keeping these little notebooks and that I was writing these plays and doing all of that, so that they were able to reinforce that in me because they thought it was wonderful. My family had never produced a full-time professional writer before. And while they were all concerned about whether or not I was going to make a living at it, on the other side of that, their feelings toward the fact that I was doing it were as strong as their fear about the fact that I was doing it. They were happy that I was going to be a writer. They thought that was wonderful, that I felt that I could join that pantheon of people, where there was Langston Hughes and there was Zora Neale Hurston, and that I was going to try to be a writer in that same tradition. So that their encouragement was very important to me. We always had lots of black books in the house, lots of all kinds of books. But I always feel sorry for people who say, I never read a black book, I never saw a black book until I was in college. Because that must be just such a big gap in how you feel about yourself, what the capabilities are that you have as a person, because you've never seen somebody do what you want to do. And I always saw black writers. My mother used to read Langston Hughes to us when we were little kids like it was a fairy tale. You know, we'd be getting ready to go to sleep and my mother would read all the fairy tales, and then sometimes she would read Langston Hughes to us. So the idea of being a writer was not mysterious to me. And the older I got, the more I was exposed not only to the literature, but also to real live black writers. All of the wild young writers from the black arts movement, Nikki Giovanni and Don Lee and Leroy Jones and Sonia Sanchez, they all would come to read at my father's church. So they would come and read their stories and read their poems and sell their books, and some of them would stay at our house because they never had any money. They were always broke, and they always had these little broke up cars, mostly Volkswagens, with a trunk full of books. And I thought that was the best life imaginable, that you got to get in this little car and drive from town to town and read these poems that you had written to black folks who wanted to hear it. And it still appeals to me as a way to live. It's still part of what I do. And I'm sure that it's because I came here knowing I wanted to write, and then had the really good fortune to be born into a family that could say, oh, okay, there's a tradition. Read this, look at this, meet this person. Think about approaching your work in this kind of way, so that it wasn't mysterious to me, and I could say I wanted it and they could understand it and send me off to college to study it. It's hard to say who's been the person who's had the biggest impact as a writer. I think I would probably have to say two people, and one is Langston Hughes, because he's probably the first writer that made an impression on me, because my mother was reading him to us when we were so young, and my mother loved Langston Hughes, so that he was like a real presence in the house for us. So that he would be the first one, because I knew him first, I knew his work first. And also because in his work, I found something that truly appealed to me, which was an absolute acceptance and love of black people. That it wasn't that Langston romanticized us, as some black writers do, where everybody's pure and all the women are saints and all the guys are heroes, and I know that's not true. I love black folks, but I know we're imperfect. And when I would read Langston Hughes, I would see all of that imperfection, but that he loved us anyway. As crazy as we could be, as, all of those ases that we are, he still loved us. And from the vantage point of being so secure in who he was as a black American, loving who he was so completely as a black American, from there he was able to travel all over the world, meet people, encounter people all over the world, write about them, and not feel confined by the fact of his race. I mean, he went places where they had never seen a black person before and had a ball because he liked people. So he would be the first one. The second one would have to be Alice Walker, because I think her work is so incredibly brave and so willing to go places where audiences may not want her to go. The fact that she would write a book about female genital mutilation is just amazing to me. And I remember reading it and thinking, this is incredible. I mean, I love this woman, and now she's written a book that talks about something unspeakable. And I would take the book and say to people, you need to read this. This is Alice's new book. And they would say, what is it about? And I would say, female genital mutilation. Nobody wanted to read it. Not one person that I tried to give that book to wanted to read it, because it was too hard. They didn't want to think about it. But the fact that she was prepared to write about it, to make herself go to those scary places, means everything to me, because every time I start feeling cocky, like, oh, I'm really bold now, I'm really doing this and I'm really doing that, and then I read something that Alice Walker has written and say, get back to work. You can't ever take for granted the fact that you've told all the truth that you know, because there's always something more. There's always something that you can dig deeper and find if you're brave enough to do it. And Alice is the one, I think, who always pushes me a little bit to do that, to say, no, go to the places where they don't want you to go. Don't just keep writing about the stuff that people want to hear from you, because that's a big challenge for writers. If you write something that you really love and your audience really loves it too, the temptation is to write that book 8 times. They loved it, I loved it, we can just do this over and over and over. But that means that you've stopped yourself at a certain point as a writer, and you've assumed your audience can't go further either. Alice never does that. So that she is a continuing inspiration to me, because she pushes herself, which in turn pushes us as her readers to think deeper, to go more. So I think between Alice and Langston, those would be the main two. And Zora sneaks in there every now and then, but I think it would have to be Alice and Langston. It's always dangerous, I think, for writers to think too hard about the creative process, because then you start analyzing it um, as opposed to trusting it. So that there's a fine line that you have to walk, I think, to talk about where all of it comes from, because the truth of the matter is, I don't know where a lot of it comes from. I know that once the idea comes, I know how to develop it. I know how to do character charts. I know how to do plot outlines. I know all that. But that's all after the idea comes, after that voice, that character, that thought, that idea comes in from whatever part of the universe it comes in from, and then you begin to apply your craft to it. I think that what I can say is that what I'm always trying to do in my life is to keep open to what's going on, to be in the moment of what's going on, to look at what's going on around me, to listen to people, to look at what they say, to look at what they do, and to think about what I'm passionate about at any given moment. What is it that's driving me crazy? I wrote a number of pieces, fiction and nonfiction, about domestic violence, because it seemed like for a period in my life I could not go anywhere in my community without seeing a woman running from somebody, without somebody coming to my door to say, please help me, without my neighbors fighting. Just the whole idea of male violence against women was so present in my environment, and I had had experience in college with an abusive man. So that I decided that I needed to really think about that, and I wrote a lot about that because I was passionate about trying to say to women, if we can't establish this one rule, no hitting us, then we can't do anything. We can talk about running the world, we can talk about being corporate executives, we can talk about starting universities, but if we can't enforce one rule, which is you don't get to hit me because you're mad, then we can't claim anything. We have no power. So that I kept trying to talk about that, and I wrote essays about it. I wrote a play, Flying West, that had at the heart of it some of that. It appears in my books where women are standing up for themselves when there is domestic violence in their environments, because I think it's important for us to know that. So that's something that came to me as an activist, really, in my life, and then became a part of the literary work that I was producing. At this moment, my real focus is on international affairs, because I think that our country has run amok in the world. I think that our president is insane. I think that our destructive power is just awesome and scary. I think the war in Iraq is nuts. So that I'm always trying to figure out a way to talk about the bigger world in my stories, which tend to be based in very small neighborhoods. So that I'm writing about West End, which is a little neighborhood in Atlanta, but I'm trying to find a way to, within writing about black women in West End, to figure out how to talk about those women in Fallujah, how to talk about those women in Afghanistan, how to make it clear that we are all connected in a way that isn't just a superficial way. That is, that we're all human beings, that when it comes to women, that many of us are mothers, that many of us are trying to figure out how to save our children in the midst of these terrible violent situations. So that my politics, once again, begin to bleed into the stories that I'm telling, because I'm always trying to say to people, look at this. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Which is part of what I think the writer's job is. When everybody else is going to their job at the factory or at the school or at the hospital, I'm looking out the window thinking about what it is that I see, what is happening to us, so that my job is to spend those hours looking and thinking and talking to people, and then write it down in the same way that somebody who's working at Ford's, their job is to be on that assembly line and make that car. So I don't have a preciousness about being an artist. I think it's a wonderful thing, but I think it's work that we've chosen to do, that we have to approach with the same discipline that people use when they're going to be a nurse and do all those terribly difficult things that nurses do, and when they're going to be a teacher and try to teach somebody how to actually read and write. All of those things I think are important, and that it's Toni K. Bambara, rest in peace, used to say that she didn't call herself an artist, she called herself a cultural worker, because it kept her from being snooty about being an artist. And I always think of that, that you have to be conscious of the fact that you're working and everybody else is working, and it's all part of the same mix that makes the neighborhood that we live in a place where we want to be. My very first novel, What Looks Like Crazy on an Ordinary Day, actually began its life as a play. I wanted it to be a play, but it couldn't be a play. It really didn't fit into the dramatic structure. as a playwright, I was trained as a playwright, I was very comfortable with writing for the stage. I had never written a novel, had never thought about writing a novel, and I was very, very, very intimidated by the idea of writing a novel. And part of the reason for that is all of the great novels that I've read. You know, when I think of a novel, I'm thinking about Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and all those people who really can intimidate you if you're a playwright thinking, well, maybe now I'll try this. So that I was determined to try to do it because I wanted to tell a story about a person who was confronting the challenge of HIV and thought her life was over, but it really wasn't. This was really a moment when her life became much richer and much fuller and more beautiful than she thought that it would. I was very concerned because so many of the people I knew at that time were in denial about AIDS. So many black people, so many black women were acting like we didn't have to worry about it, we didn't have to think about it. Only gay white men had to think about it and we don't care about them, and all of that kind of homophobic fantasy dialogue was going on in our community. So I wanted to make a likable black woman character, hard-working woman that was likable, that we would like, understand, sounded just like us, and then let her have to face the challenge of HIV. So that I gave the proposal to the publisher, and they liked the idea, and I started working on it. And I was trying to write third person, because at that time I thought if you were going to write a real novel, you had to write third person as opposed to first person. And I wrote about 200 pages. And I had a terrible time doing it. I hated the process, didn't like it, found myself doing housework rather than going to my desk, which is always a good sign because I don't care a thing about housework. So that if I find myself washing windows, washing the kitchen floor, I know that is because my work is not going well. So I had to say, okay, what's the problem? What is the problem? And the thing was, I was trying to write in a voice that was not my own. So I threw away the first 200 pages, stomped around my house and was really evil because that's a lot of pages to throw out. And then started back writing again, same story, but I let the main character speak in her own voice, so she was speaking first person. I'm a playwright. I'm used to making people talk. That's what I do. So that once I let her start talking as Ava Johnson and saying what she felt, what she saw, it was fun for me. And then I was able to finish the book, and hopefully it was fun for the people reading it. But it became a process that was much more familiar to me once I started first person. I sent it to the publisher, and they hated it. They thought it was just the worst thing. My editor thought it was the worst thing she had ever seen. She kept it for like 6 months, didn't respond to me, didn't tell me what she thought about it, but I knew she didn't like it. You know, if you get something and you don't hear anything for 6 months. Finally, she called me and said, I'm so sorry that it took so long for me to contact you to get back to you, but this book is unpublishable. It's really awful. You should throw it away. And I know that you might think that you should take it to another publisher, but you shouldn't do it, because if this book is ever published, it will ruin your career as a writer and you'll never publish again. So I'm a first-time novelist, and this woman is saying this to me, and she was a black woman from Detroit. So I trusted her. I felt like, you know, this is my sister. She'll tell me the truth. So I said, okay, this is not good. This is not good. So I called another friend of mine, Bebe Moore Campbell, who was also a black woman novelist who had been writing novels. And I said, Bebe, let me tell you what's happening. So I told her my tale of woe. And she said, well, what did your agent say? I said, I don't have an agent. And she said, what do you mean you don't have an agent? And I said, well, they came to me, and this was a black woman. I'm a black woman. I figured she would look out for me. So Bebe read me the Riot Act for about 15 minutes about how you cannot assume that a publisher and a writer have the same interests, all those things that I should have known, but really didn't. So she gave me some names to call for people, and I called several of the agents that she had suggested. And the one that I decided to go with was Denise Stinson, who was another black woman from Detroit. And I told her what had happened, and she said, well, send me your manuscript, and I'll read it. And if it's any good, we'll sell it to someone else. Don't worry about it. Send it to me. So I sent it to her, and she read it immediately and called me up and said, your editor is crazy. I know I can sell this book. And she did. She sold it to another publisher, like within 48 hours, actually. She sold it to the people. They gave me a bigger advance so I could pay off the old advance and still had a few dollars to pay my rent. And the publisher really liked it. They published 30,000 copies in hardback, which was lovely. It sold, well, they sold 30,000 copies in hardback, actually. I don't know how many they published, but that was a good number for them. They were very happy, invited me to New York and took me to one of those little shishi restaurants where the food is like sitting in the middle of the plate. It's that big with little things sticking in it and stuff on the plate. And I'm saying, well, I am in high cotton now. I am sitting here in New York eating with these people. And they were happy. We agreed that I would do another. That was fine. And then that was 97. The book came out in 97, and the paperback would be out in 98. And then Oprah called and said that Susan Taylor had given her the book, and she really liked it and wanted to pick it for their October 98 book club. And I said, great. I'm sure I squealed and hollered and did several other things that I will not replicate for you. But it was a wonderful, wonderful thing, because the commercial visibility that that book club gives you as an author is something that you can't really point to anywhere else. It's a unique kind of thing that is only because she is who she is. But every single book that she's picked became a New York Times bestseller. Now, as a first-time novelist, for my book to go from, they were very happy at 30,000 copies, to 9 weeks on the New York Times list, up to number 2 on the list actually, and sold almost 800,000 copies. They were ecstatic. They were beside themselves. I was very happy, but at that point I was already working on another book. So you had that wonderful commercial moment where you say, this is great, I can pay off all my bills, I can put a new roof on my house, I can do all the things I need to do, which is wonderful. But the other side of your brain is saying, but I still got to write this next book. And commercial success doesn't help you write better. You know, it helps you be able to keep the lights on and keep that computer on and all of that. But it doesn't do what some people think it will do, which is make the process easier. The process is always the same. Find those characters, find that story, sit at that desk, write on that paper, put those words there. But it was a wonderful moment for me, because it expanded my audience just geometrically. Which was wonderful, because a lot of those people continued to look for my work after that. Some of them only were looking for Oprah. Whatever Oprah picked, that's what they would buy. But I understood that, so that it was a wonderful commercial boost for me, and gave me a lot of bargaining chips with the publishers that I would not have had before. So that it really was a great gift to me, and I appreciate it. I think she did a wonderful thing for writers and for book clubs. Well, I actually wanted to set the first one in Atlanta, because I've lived here for so long that I know that, you know, if you're not born in Atlanta, you're never really an Atlantan. They will tell you this. But I've been here for most of my life now, so that I really feel like this is my home. But I was so intimidated by the form when I was trying to write my first novel that I thought Atlanta would be too big and complex a place for me to get my mind around, in addition to trying to just deal with the form of, oh my God, can I actually do this? Atlanta itself was a big enough challenge that I felt like it was going to be too much for me. So that I set the books in Idlewild, because I knew Idlewild. Idlewild's a little place. I had gone there almost every summer when I was a kid, because my grandfather had a house there. So that we used to go there as city kids from Detroit. And all of us, my cousins, all of us would go, because my grandfather had 7 children. So that we had lots of cousins, and all of us would go. And it was wonderful, because it was a little tiny all-black resort. We could run around. Our mothers would let us go out. We didn't care. In Detroit, you know, my mother kept a very close eye on us, because it was a great big rough city. In Idlewild, we thought we had died and gone to heaven, because we could just play all day, run around. It was lovely. Several years ago, my sister, who lives there, had moved there several years ago, and she still lives there, called me and said, well, we had our first drive-by in Idlewild. I couldn't imagine how a little place like that could have a drive-by. I mean, there's no intersections. How can you, there's dirt roads. How can you have a drive-by? And she said, well, the drugs, lots of drugs, the resort business had gone bust once integration came. Black people stopped going to all of these all-black resorts and started going to Club Med and all of those other places. So the black resorts died, and Idlewild was one of them. So there was tremendous unemployment, tremendous drug abuse, lots of problems with young people having children, not knowing how to take care of their kids, all of that. So that when I thought about the problems that I wanted to look at in Atlanta, they were already present in Idlewild in an environment that I felt like I could manage. So that I set the first book there. And then the second one, I hadn't really thought would go back to Idlewild, but Joyce, who is the older sister of the main character of the first book, Joyce really had some more story that I wanted to tell. So I wish I had a Red Dresses back in Idlewild, and some of the same characters recur. After I had written 2 novels, I felt like I was ready to write something set in Atlanta. I did cheat a little bit because my books are set in Southwest Atlanta. The characters in these books almost never leave Southwest Atlanta. They're like me. They go from Spelman to I-285. That's it. They do not go farther than that. So that my taking on Atlanta was really taking on one community in Atlanta. And I've lived in Southwest almost the whole time that I'd lived in Atlanta. So that I was aware of the wonderful things about Southwest Atlanta, but also the problems, also the unemployment, the angry young people, the drugs, the housing problems, the trash on the street, all of those urban problems that I could see in my neighborhood. So that when I started writing about West End, I wanted to say, what if it was West End, except better, except the trash was out of the streets, except women could walk around at 4 in the morning safe because there was no male violence against women, except that all the crack houses were gone and there were community gardens everywhere. What if it was us, but better? So that was really what some things I never thought I'd do was really trying to look at our neighborhood that way. My new book, which will be out next month, Babylon Sisters, is also set in West End, and the one I'm working on now is set in West End, because it's such a rich environment, and it has all the stories, all the kinds of stories that I would want to tell, and I know it so well. The reason that you could visualize so easily what I was writing about in West End is because you know West End, I know West End, so I know where the Krispy Kreme is. I know what the West End Mall is like. I know where the Wig Palace is across the street from the mall. So that when I'm trying to create an environment for my characters to move around in, it's helpful for a writer. The better you know that environment, the more you can put in the details that make people who read it say, wow, that sounds so real, you know, and the people who actually live there can say, you know, that's true. That's really how it feels to be there. So it's wonderful for me to write about the neighborhood that I live in, although people will correct me if I get it wrong. In between the time I wrote some things I thought I'd never do and the book, the time I wrote it and the time it came out, the Krispy Kreme had moved. It was on the corner, and then it moved like halfway down the block. So a woman came up to me after the book came out and said, your book is great, I really love it, but the Krispy Kreme is not on the corner of Ashby and Abernathy. The Krispy Kreme is on the corner of, and I said, I'm so sorry. The book was published afterward. In the next one, I'll correct it. So in the next one, you know I corrected it. It had the people going through the drive-through because the new one has a drive-through. But it's nice that people feel proprietary about the books, that they really understand what it is I'm trying to do and want me to get it right, because I want to get it right too. I think the most important thing for any writer is to train your mind to think as a writer. You have to write every day. You have to keep journals. You have to write down what you think and feel and experience in the world. Because what you're doing when you say you want to write is saying, I'm going to observe the world and have some comments that are so astute and so true and so helpful that you should stop doing whatever you're doing and read what I'm thinking. And that's really kind of an arrogant thing to say to people, you know, that I think what I have to say is so important that you need to read it. So that if you're going to ask people to do that, you have to practice to get good at it. So when they say, okay, well, let me see what you got to say, you will have written in your journal, you will have practiced, you will have honed your craft, so that then when they do take that time to read you, what they will find is a true story that they believe, a character that seems like a real person, dialogue that seems like people really talk. And that doesn't just happen. You have to practice. And I think many of us, when we first start writing, think that writing is easier than other kinds of artistic expression because it's using tools that we all have. We all talk, we all write letters, we write papers, we use the language, so that we don't think about writing as difficult to master in the same way that we think about playing a saxophone as being a difficult task. Being a ballerina is a difficult task. So you know, if you say, I want to be a ballet dancer, you have to get up every day and practice. I want to be an ice skater, you got to get up every day and practice. If you say, I want to be a writer, you have to do the same thing. You have to make time every day to practice, to look at the world and write down what you saw. I used to, when I was very young, ride the bus in Detroit, and I would sit behind people and write down their conversations. And it used to drive my sister crazy because she would say, they're going to turn around and see that you were doing this and throw us off this bus. But nobody, you know, two little kids riding the bus, they didn't care. But I wanted to get the rhythms right. I wanted to know how people say what they say in real life. Because, you know, in many books, the characters talk the way you've never heard a living human being talk in your life. I never want that. I always want the dialogue, the settings, the stories to be something that people recognize. And that's because I practice all the time. So that the best advice I think that I ever got as a young person writing was, you have to do it every day. Every single day, even if it's just 15 minutes whining in your journal saying, I'm too tired, I don't feel like doing this. If you do it every day, eventually you will find that you do have something to say when you do your practice runs and all of that. The other thing is to not obsess about every little thing that you write, about every story, every essay, every play, every poem. The journey has to be the journey to create a body of work, a body of information that you're giving out to people. More than one essay, more than one poem, more than one book, more than one play, as much as you can, so that you don't begin to stop yourself and censor yourself because I can't let this book out because it's not perfect. This story is not perfect. Perfection is not the goal. Each time you're going to get better. And if you're really working as a writer, it's never going to be perfect because you'll always know more than you can get down on that page. The frustration of writing, I think, is that you know so much as a writer if you're conscious and you're honing your craft and you're reading the newspaper and talking to people and thinking about the world. But then when you actually have to get it from your head onto the page, it's never as perfect as it was when you first thought it. So then you have to say, okay, that was the best I could do for that one. Let me take a minute, take a breath, go drink some orange juice, come back and start the next book and hope it'll be closer to the truth. Start the next play, hope it'll be closer. But many people get stymied early on because they're trying to make that very first effort be the Pulitzer Prize winner. And it's destructive. Don't even think about it. Finish it, do the next one. Finish it, do the next one. Ooh, in 100 years. I can't imagine. I cannot imagine what a book would say about me in 100 years. I would like to think that when people look at my work in 100 years, that what will come through to them is the truth of it, that these are still real people, that they still seem true to the moment that we're living in. That would be a great satisfaction to me if someone was going to write about me in 100 years, if they said, you know, she really tried to tell the truth. I think that would be the thing that would make me, wherever I am in 100 years, really feel good about the work that I had done, because that's always what I'm trying to do, get to the truth of it, you know, and there's different ways to do that. You know, you make people laugh, you make people cry, you make them really remember something that seems similar to what happened to them, but at the heart of it is always that moment where the person says, that's true. That's what I know too. That feels like what it feels like to me. And I think those are the books we remember, where there's a scene that makes you absolutely remember that day at your grandmother's house when you were 8 years old and she made a pie. And if you read that in a book later, it will bring back all your own memories, which you then overlay on whatever this writer has written. And those are the books that we take to that desert island with us whenever we know we're going to have one book to read for the rest of your life. What would you take? It's the one that seems the truest to what you know as a human being. So I'm always trying to get there to where the truth is.